She was crying like I had never heard a woman cry before in my life.
And I just cried for weeks and weeks. Everything reminded me of a baby.
And I kept trying to get up from the table and look to see what was in that jar.
I was dealing with the loss of my unborn child and I didn't even know it.
I believe that my life was spared that night just so that I could be here right now and say abortion hurts women.
Whisper, be silent no more.
Welcome to Faces of Abortion. I'm your host, Cindy Collins, and today we have a very special program with Julia Holcomb, who will be telling her story of abortion's impact on her and on this generation. So now let's go and listen to Julia's story. Welcome back to Faces of Abortion. We have a very special guest with us today. Again, through Skype technology, we have Julia Holcomb. And Julia, welcome to Faces of Abortion.
Thank you, Cindy.
We're just so excited and just very thankful that you're here with us and the courage that you have to share your story of the impact of abortion on your life. And I know, Julia, you also have a message for young women also in your story and families, particularly because of the relationship that you had with Steven Tyler. And what I'd like for you to do is begin to share a little bit about that relationship with Steven Tyler and how that led you into the relationship and the impact of abortion.
I met Steven when I was just 16 years old. I had just had my 16th birthday when I met Steven at a concert in Portland, Oregon. He was the lead singer of the rock group Aerosmith, and many people know him today as a former American Idol judge. But this was a long time ago. I was a very young girl, and I idolized Steven, and we began a relationship that night that lasted about 3 years. After we met, I moved to Boston to live with Steven. I can remember my mother driving me to the airport and saying goodbye to me. I got on a plane and I arrived and I moved into Steven's apartment with him. Because I was underage, he became my legal guardian, and my mother signed over guardianship of me to Steven. And I can remember when he told me that my mother had signed the guardianship papers. It was a bewildering moment. I remember not really fully understanding what it meant. I knew that we wouldn't be married, but he would be like a father figure, and yet we were in a relationship. I was taking the birth control pill, and we began to tour together. I remember traveling with the band, going to lots of different locations in different cities, and sitting on the side of the stage watching Steven sing and thinking that in some ways I was very lucky. I remember thinking that he was just everything to me at that time. So I didn't really understand the dangers that lifestyle could hold for me. I didn't understand that I was on a path that would lead me to the brink of death and to a wound I would carry with me throughout my entire life.
I know, Julia, you were a very vulnerable, young woman, and can just tell just even the preciousness, in your spirit right now of that vulnerability and seeing someone that was, idolized literally, at that time in your life. I know that relationship had grown, and had you talked about having children, or what was his thought about that?
We had been together for less than a year. We went to his family's resort in New Hampshire, and it was there that Steven was reminded of his desire to have a family. And we were out on the road after returning to the tour, and he asked me if I would like to have a child with him. I can remember thinking that would be wonderful. I loved children. I thought he must truly love me and care for me if he was asking me to have a baby with him. I told him yes, and I can remember we were in a hotel in a large city, and we were on a balcony looking down on the street below. There were a lot of people and cars driving by. It was nighttime, and Stephen just took my birth control pills and tossed them off the balcony. And I became open to life within our relationship at that point. I didn't become pregnant right away. It was about a year later. He had been gone for a few weeks on tour. He came back, and I can remember being excited to tell him that I was pregnant. I remember he was surprised. It was like he had forgotten that I wasn't taking any contraceptives. But he was kind to me, and I can remember his reaction at first was one of, he responded happily, and a few months later, he came to me and told me that we were going to marry, and I was thrilled. I remember thinking that my life could not get better than this. We were going to have a baby, and we were going to get married and have a family of our own. And I idolized him. I thought he was just wonderful. I thought my life was kind of at a pinnacle, and it's amazing how fast things can change. We went to his parents' resort again, and we told them of our intention to marry and of the baby that we were expecting. And that night just did not go well at all. His parents were very nice people. His father was very serious. He was very reserved. He spoke to Stephen privately of his unwillingness to support our decision to get married. His mother was she was a sweet lady. I remember loving her dearly. She was supportive. She thought we would have a difficult time, but that we would just have to get through it, and that one step at a time we'd make it. But he also, his grandmother was living there with his parents. She was very elderly. He was the oldest son of an Italian family, and he asked his grandmother if she would give us her wedding ring for us to marry with. And she didn't think we looked like a very good bet. She thought that our relationship looked very unstable, and she told us that if our marriage ended in divorce, that the ring might leave the family, and she declined to give the ring. And at that point, things just went downhill for the two of us. We went back to Boston, where our apartment was, and we quarreled. We fought. I remember thinking, for the first time, realizing how vulnerable my position was. Stephen was the one making all the decisions. He was the one who had wanted to have a baby, and then here I was. I thought he would stand by me, but I could see at this point his attitude had changed. He did not want to marry, and we went back to our apartment, and things were just in limbo. I wasn't really sure what would happen next. I remember thinking, well, we'll just live together and have our baby. And
I know that you had told us earlier also that you were somewhat staying in that apartment, and at one point had not been able to even get out and get any food. And there was somebody that he had sent over to go ahead and what you thought was going to go ahead and take you out to go shopping. Mm-hmm. Would you share with us a little bit about what happened during that time?
We went to our apartment, and Stephen made the decision to resume his tour with the band, and he decided not to take me with him. I was at least 5 months pregnant, but I don't really know how far along I was. I had not seen a doctor. Stephen didn't want me to go into a doctor and have them ask questions like, who's the father of your baby, and how did you become pregnant, because he felt that he might get in trouble. So I hadn't been to a doctor. I was there at the apartment by myself. He had left me with a little bit of money. When it ran out, I was there with just the food that was left when he left. And when that ran out, I had no car to go anywhere. I didn't have a driver's license. I had dropped out of high school, so I was uneducated. And he would just call in the evenings and check on me to see how I was doing. When the food ran out, I told him I needed to go shopping. He said he would send Ray Tabano over to the apartment the next day, and that Ray would take me to the grocery store. And that was something that he had done before. Ray had come in the past and helped run errands for Stephen. So I remember thinking, this is great. I'm going to get out of the apartment. I'm going to go shopping. Everything's going to be better tomorrow. I got up early. I sat by the window and waited for Ray to come. I can still remember watching him walk up the stairs to that apartment, and I let him in to our apartment. That's one of the last clear memories that I have of that day. I woke up in a fire. Ray was gone, and we had not gone shopping, and there was so much smoke in the apartment I couldn't see anything in front of me except black smoke. I was choking for air. I was laying on a sofa right near the front door, and I stood up and fell over a coffee table that was in front of me. On the floor, I could see because there was less smoke. The air was clearer there, and I could see from the floor where the doorway was, and I just began to crawl for that doorway, trying to get out of the apartment. That door was locked. There were multiple locks on that door, but there was one lock that was like a bar that extended from the door to the floor. Normally that bar lock would just slide out of the way, but it was jammed, it wouldn't move, and I was in a panic. I remember feeling that I had to get out of that apartment immediately or I would choke to death on the smoke. I crawled for the back stairway, and that's where the fire, what I remember was the fire coming from that stairway. I remember reaching out for the railing of the stair and burning my hand and realizing that there was no way out. That stairway led to the only other exit in a kitchen. And I had remembered a public service announcement I had seen on television that had said what to do if you're trapped in a fire and can't get out. It had said, look for an empty fireplace and open the flue so that you can get some air. There was a bedroom right across from that stairway. It was our bedroom, and there was a fireplace. It was clean. We had never used it, and when I crawled into that fireplace, I collapsed on the floor, and the flue was already open. Hanging over that fireplace was a picture of Jesus that my grandmother had given me. It's this picture that's right behind me. It's called The Light of the World. It was painted by Charles Chambers. When I was a little girl, my grandmother was my first grade teacher, and at that time, every classroom had one of these pictures hanging in the front of the classroom. And I can remember my grandmother opening first grade class in prayer every day. Over the years, they changed the rules at that school and asked the teachers to take down those pictures of Jesus. And my grandmother took her picture with her when she retired. The principal asked her to take it home. And when she died, she gave it to me, and it had always been very dear to me. I brought it with me to Boston, and I remembered it hanging above me. I mean, I remembered it feeling like it reminded me that Jesus was there with me like a child, very loving and caring, and that I could pray for help. Laying in that fireplace, I felt that I was about to die, and I knew that I was not prepared to die. I had committed very many grave sins that weighed on my conscience at that moment, and I felt afraid to die. I began to pray for mercy, and my grandmother had made me memorize Bible verses as a little girl, and one of them was words from the Psalm that echoed Jesus' words on the cross. It was the words, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit. Thou hast redeemed me, O Lord God of truth." And I prayed those words, and I didn't expect to live, but at that moment I felt so much more peace. I wasn't frightened anymore, and that was the last thing I remember. God's very good to me.
Julia, I know that just envisioning that and then seeing the love of your grandmother for you carrying forward, and I remember you sharing that that's not where all of the trauma ended, that you ended up in the hospital and then had some situations going on with some doctors that took you to the next level, next step in your life.
That's right. It seemed like a miracle when I woke up in the hospital and I was alive and well, The doctors had thought I would not survive. I'd had severe smoke inhalation. I had lost a lot of oxygen to the brain. They said that if I lived, I might have brain damage. I woke up, I could talk, I could answer questions, and the doctors were very surprised. But that was really where the worst ordeal began, because before I could leave that hospital, Stephen came to me and told me that I was going to have an abortion. And I remember just being devastated. I had never dreamed of having an abortion. I was looking forward to my baby being born. I loved my child. I cared very deeply for Stephen, and the idea of an abortion was just something that I couldn't even begin to grasp. I remember arguing with Stephen for several hours in the hospital, just telling him no many times, that I would not have an abortion. Eventually, we were so just separated from one another. We wouldn't even look at each other. We just looked at the floor. There was such a gulf between us. And it was at that point Stephen put the decision as a choice between him and my baby. I could have that abortion, or I could basically hit the street. And it was just a frightening position to be in. I had never really thought of being put in a position where I wasn't sure if I could go home to my parents, and I didn't know what would happen to me if Stephen rejected me. And I just caved in fear and desperation. And that's one of the things that so many times people in the United States, we think coerced abortion doesn't happen here. But the truth is really that a coercion happens anywhere abortion is legal. There have been 54 million abortions in the United States since Roe versus Wade. And of those 54 million, over 60% involve coercion at some level. And my experience was one of those, where I was being forced to choose between my baby and the home I was living in, the person I was in a relationship with, and it was a frightening place to be.
I know, Julia, that you felt that pressure as a young woman, and then having the abortion was a very traumatic experience for you. Very traumatic, because you were late term, and there was something that Stephen told you after the abortion that was even more shocking.
It was hard to believe how this abortion unfolded. I was in the hospital. First, I was told that my baby wasn't really a baby yet, that it was a fetus, and that my abortion would not be very difficult. I was brought into there was another doctor there waiting to do the abortion. Stephen had his attorneys there, and I was wheeled into a room. I was naked. I was given very little information about what would happen next. I remember the doctor standing beside me, and I did not see that he was holding a needle, but he had a large needle in his hand, and he told me, hold very still, or you could be killed or injured. And I can remember just freezing in shock and disbelief, and wondering, what did he just say? And before I could even ask him, what did he mean? He had stabbed my uterus with this needle, and he began injecting saline into my womb. And it was at that point they told me that my baby was no longer living, and that I was going to be taken to another part of the hospital, where I was going to wait for the baby's lifeless body to be delivered. And Stephen was with me the whole time. He was there when the doctor performed the abortion, and he went with me into this room where I began to labor. And I was there for many hours, and it was a very painful ordeal to endure. And I remember crying. I remember the nurses being angry and put out with me. They felt that I shouldn't have any pain, that it shouldn't have been painful. When the baby began to be delivered, the last thing I remember was the nurse giving me a shot, and I went to sleep. And I don't know what happened after that. I do remember waking up from that abortion and being just so grieved and wounded. It was like part of me had died when my baby died. I was altered. I had always been a very happy, cheerful person. But after that abortion, I was, I guess you might say I was very depressed, and I just wasn't the same person. Stephen, after a few weeks, saw that I wasn't recovering very well, and he took me to New Hampshire, thinking that being out in the country outdoors would help me to kind of snap out of it. We were on a day trip out on a Jeep in the woods, and we were in the back of the Jeep. It was open air. There was no windows. It was just an open Jeep. There was someone else driving, and he began talking to me about the abortion. And he told me that my baby had been born alive, that the nurse had had to do something after the baby was born because it was still living. And I can remember those words coming out of his mouth and just hearing them in disbelief and thinking, how can that be true? How could a baby come into this world and still be alive after someone trying to take its life through an abortion? And how could it be then just allowed to die or killed? That seemed like something so unbelievable I couldn't really grasp it. I began to cry, and I asked Stephen, how could that be legal? How could they just kill it if it was still alive? How could that? They said it wasn't a baby. They said it was a fetus. How could it be born alive then and have to be killed?
And Julia, you know, you think about that's happening in our nation, and just hearing your story, but I also know that you have received a lot of healing from the Lord, and that's how you're able to talk freely from a healing and forgiveness perspective, and even of forgiveness towards Stephen. And just in the few closing moments that we have, I'd like for you to share in that forgiveness, and that is such a powerful part of your testimony now, that you're also a part of Rachel's Vineyard and have been able to share and talk to your family also. How did that come about?
Well, that abortion really destroyed the relationship that Stephen and I had. I don't think we could ever really look at each other again without remembering our baby that was no longer living and what had happened that day. I went home about a year later, and I was really just a wounded spirit. I didn't have bitterness towards Stephen, but I did have a deep sense of loss and grief. And that was where God in his goodness, my mother had just really made a lot of progress in her life. She was attending a church, and they were going to a church camp, and they invited me to come with them. So I went along, and it was there that the young people at that church camp introduced me to Jesus. It had been a long time since I'd thought about Christ as being someone who was a living person who could be a part of my life. But I could see Jesus in their faces and in their lives, and I asked Jesus to become a part of my life, and I began a conversion process. I was baptized, and I began to read my Bible, and that helped to form my conscience. And then later, years later, after I had met my husband and we married, we also were drawn to the Catholic Church. We felt the Catholic teaching on life was something that was an evidence of truth and something that we wanted to embrace wholeheartedly. And I also looked forward to going to confession. I can remember my first confession. I dreaded it, and I longed for it at the same time. And I remember having just tears of joy on my face after that first confession. I was in the confessional a long time. I had many grave sins to confess, my abortion first among them. But afterwards I felt so much peace and grace from God. And also after that, I embraced the church's teachings on openness and respect for life. And today, my husband and I have been married for 31 years. We have 7 beautiful children that have been a gift, a treasure that God has entrusted to us. And I see myself in my role as wife and mother as a guardian of life, someone who has been entrusted with the lives of my children, and that it's a privilege to love and protect them. And one of the important paths to healing for me, besides confession, and baptism was a Rachel's Vineyard retreat. At that retreat, I was able to really grieve and embrace Christ's forgiveness.
We thank you so much for sharing your story, and it's so powerful, and to honor Michael today and to talk about the Rachel's Vineyard retreat, and want to thank you so much with being with us on Faces of Abortion and having the courage to tell your story. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. God bless.
You've just watched a powerful interview with Julia Holcomb, who had had an abortion at a very young age. And I know, Molly, it was very traumatic for her, especially as she was trusting Steven Tyler and influenced and coerced by so many people and not knowing where to turn.
Right, she didn't have anyone to run home to or run to, you know, her family. She didn't know would receive her, and she was really in a vulnerable spot, and then coerced into doing something she really didn't want to do. And it's so common, Cindy. It's, you know, women are seeking help, not abortion. But then when they don't find that help and support, then they're more easily to be coerced into doing something that they really don't want to do.
I know, and I take that story, although he was well known, it also shows the influence on young women in this generation as they may be influenced by older men or by family members that are around, and they feel all alone, like Julia did. And I know in the second part of her story we're going to be hearing, you know, a little bit more of how she was able to receive help and hope.
Right, but it shows you too how vulnerable young women can be. You know, she got wrapped up in the rock and roll and the glamour and the traveling, but really, like she said, she didn't realize that she was on a path that led to a lot of destruction and bad decisions and choices for her. So this might be an encouragement to young women that not every light that shines bright really leads you down the right path.
And that leads me to, just as you're saying that, I was thinking of her grandmother and the picture of Jesus that she had behind her, and how the prayers of her grandmother, they were there, and how those prayers, and she remembered. And I just feel, Molly, that there may be somebody that's watching today that needs to remember that Jesus is there.
Yes, you do. And just like Julia's grandmother had prayed over her, she had Jesus hanging over the fireplace when she was fighting for her life in that fire. Jesus is with you. He's with me. He's everywhere. And if you are lost and alone and you're struggling with an abortion, or just hearing her testimony and you haven't had an abortion, but it causes you to have a lot of compassion, just trust in the Lord. Cry out to the Lord Jesus, because He is there to save, deliver, and heal.
Thank you for watching Faces of Abortion, a production of Operation Outcry. If you would like to make comments about our program or find out how you can get involved, please call 1-866-4-OUTCRY or visit our website, operationoutcry.org. We want to hear from you.
Whisper